Alright, let's dive into the story of how the French settled in North America and the epic showdown that eventually erupted between the French and the British over who would control this vast new territory. Spoiler alert, the outcome of this fight would shape the future of North America, but let's not jump ahead just yet. To understand why the French were so eager to come to the New World, we first need to talk about France itself. Who were these people brave enough to cross the Atlantic and set up shop in what's now Canada, New Orleans, and a few other areas? Imagine this, a country sandwiched between England and Spain, both of which have their own ambitions for global domination. That's France. Now, let's hit the rewind button and travel back to around the year 1500, when the French started making their way to North America. But before we talk about that, let's clear up a few misconceptions about France that many Americans today might have. You know, if you ask the average person in the US what comes to mind when they think of the French, you might get some, let's say, colorful responses. Baguettes, berets, mimes, and that whole French surrender stereotype from World War II. But let's be real, none of that really captures the France of the 1500s and 1600s, and honestly, it's not the France of today either. So, let's put those cliches aside. The France we're talking about was a powerhouse in the making, but not without its challenges. Unlike Spain and Portugal, which were unified by fighting off external threats like the Moors, France had its own internal drama. By the 1500s, France had managed to pull itself together under a single king, an absolute monarch, similar to Spain's king. This king had almost complete control, without the pesky interference of a parliament like in England. But don't get too cozy with the idea of unity. The French aristocrats were a bit more rebellious than their Spanish counterparts, so it wasn't all smooth sailing. France's unity was also a bit shaky because of its history of civil wars, particularly in the 1300s and 1400s. Fast forward to the 1500s, and France was dealing with even more internal strife. Thanks to the Protestant Reformation, here's the quick rundown. While England was busy breaking away from the Catholic Church to form its own Church of England, some folks in France started questioning the Catholic Church too. They didn't want to follow the Pope or the Church's hierarchy, but they still wanted to be Christians. So Protestantism started to take root. Now, the Protestants were always outnumbered by the Catholics in France, but they didn't go down without a fight. The result? A series of brutal civil wars between the two religious groups. The Catholic Church, backed by the French kings, eventually came out on top, but not before a whole lot of blood was shed. Imagine something straight out of a medieval version of Game of Thrones, like the Red Wedding. In fact, there's even a painting that depicts a real event in French history that was eerily similar to that infamous episode. So yeah, things got pretty intense. Even though the Protestants were a minority, they managed to stir up enough trouble to keep France on edge for a while, and this internal conflict, mixed with the ambitions of an absolute monarch, would set the stage for France's adventures in the New World. But let's save that part of the story for later. Things are just starting to get interesting. So, while France is firmly Catholic, during this period, it's not quite as intensely religious as Spain. Spain, of course, went through the Reconquista, fighting to reclaim its lands from the Moors, which cemented its close ties with the Catholic Church. France, on the other hand, didn't have this external threat pushing it into the arms of the Church, so while it's Catholic, it's not uber-Catholic like Spain. And remember, France still has a small but vocal Protestant population within its borders, which keeps things interesting. One thing to know about France is that it's got some of the most fertile land in Europe, even more so than Spain. This means that France can support a much larger population, about 20 million people by the mid-1660s compared to Spain's 7 million and England's 5 million, and this large population is going to be a big deal, especially when it comes to putting boots on the ground in wars, Quantity often plays a big role, and France can field a massive army because of its large population. While Spain might be rolling in New World gold and England is building its commercial and military navy, France is consistently fielding one of the largest and best trained armies in Europe. And why does France need such a big, tough army? Because it's surrounded by a bunch of enemies. Spain, for instance, might have Portugal as a frenemy, but France is constantly dealing with threats from all sides. Territorial disputes with Spain over the Pyrenees Mountains, skirmishes with smaller kingdoms, and later more unified threats from Austria and eventually Germany. France is always on guard, and to defend its borders, it has to militarize. But it's not just about having a big army, it's about having a smart, well-trained army. And this is where France really stands out. While Spain and England are doing their own thing, France is diving headfirst into a renaissance that's even more profound than what you see in those other countries. The Italian Renaissance in the 1500s sparked a revival of ancient knowledge, science, literature, art, all of which had flourished under the Romans. During the Middle Ages, Europe didn't exactly see a boom in these areas. Sorry, medieval historians, but facts are facts. But in the 1500s, Italy started battle, it's sending in soldiers who've been trained with the latest and greatest tactics, equipped with the best weapons, and backed by a state that's always looking for ways to improve. In a nutshell, France is building a military machine that's second to none, all while juggling religious conflicts at home and threats from its neighbors. And as they bring this powerhouse to the New World, the stage is set for some serious clashes with the British. Stay tuned because this story is just heating up. France, during the 1600s and 1700s, is a nation under the rule of an absolute monarch, though it's not as ironclad as what you'd see in Spain. While the French king holds significant power, civil wars and internal conflicts occasionally rock the nation, making it a bit less unified than Spain. But make no mistake, France is still a Catholic nation through and through, even though Protestant groups do pop up from time to time, leading to some serious religious tension, yet Catholicism remains dominant, with the French monarch firmly in the Catholic camp. France also boasts a large population and a well-trained army. Thanks to its fertile land, France can support more people than Spain or England, which is a huge advantage when it comes to building a military. And let's not forget, France is at the forefront of scientific, military, and artistic thought during this period, making its army not just large, but also incredibly advanced and well prepared. But what about France's role in the New World? Well, unlike Spain, which started planting its flag in the Americas as early as 1492, France was a bit of a latecomer. The Spanish were all over the place by the late 1400s, and throughout the 1500s, establishing settlements in the Caribbean, Mexico, South America, and beyond. Meanwhile, the English and French were barely dipping their toes into the New World. For the most part, the only English and Frenchmen crossing the Atlantic in the 1500s were fishermen, traders, or pirates, certainly not state-sponsored colonists. The French, like the English, were mostly focused on temporary activities, fishing in the rich waters off Newfoundland, trading with indigenous peoples, or occasionally pirating Spanish ships. These weren't government-backed missions, but rather independent ventures by individuals looking to make a quick profit. Sure, there were a few attempts at settlement, but the Spanish quickly snuffed them out. So, for the most part, the French presence in the New World during the 1500s was pretty minimal. However, there was one notable exception, a Frenchman named Jacques Cartier. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about him, but Cartier was an explorer and trader who gave France a leg up in the New World by exploring the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s. Cartier hoped the river might be a passage to Asia, an idea that never really seemed to die, even well into the 1700s and early 1800s. Although he didn't get far due to the river's rapids, his exploration laid the groundwork for future French claims in the region. Where the French really excelled in the 1500s, though, was in the fur trade, particularly in harvesting beaver pelts. Both the French and the English traded with local indigenous groups, offering European goods like hatchets and knives in exchange for valuable beaver fur. The beaver, a cold-weather mammal that lives in water, has incredibly dense fur, which was highly prized in Europe for making warm, luxurious hats. This fur trade would become the backbone of the French economy in the New World, and especially once it became known how soft and warm it was. As French and English explorers and merchants ventured into the colder regions of North America initially for fishing, they quickly realized the value of trading with local indigenous populations for beaver pelts. The Europeans would bring over simple goods like hatchets, knives, and metal cooking pots, items that were revolutionary to the indigenous peoples whose tools were primarily made from stone. For the indigenous people, a steel hatchet or a metal pot was a game changer, drastically improving their efficiency in daily tasks like chopping wood or cooking. This led to a lucrative trade for the French merchants. They could bring a small number of metal goods, trade them for large quantities of beaver pelts, and return to France to sell these furs at a high price to the European elite who had developed a craze for beaver fur hats, coats, and other garments. The profit margins were immense, as a single hatchet could be traded for a significant number of pelts, which in turn could be sold for a large amount of money in Europe. However, by the late 1500s, the French fur traders began facing increased competition. As word spread of the profitability of the beaver fur trade, more merchants, not only from France but also from England, started arriving in the same regions to trade. This influx of traders led to increased competition for the beaver pelts, which drove up the price. Indigenous groups, now more knowledgeable about the value of their furs, began demanding more in exchange for them. What once might have been a trade of one hatchet for 100 beaver pelts now became one hatchet for only 10 pelts, as English traders offered better deals or flooded the market. This competition squeezed profit margins for the French fur traders and set the stage for a more complex and competitive colonial economy in North America. It also foreshadowed the fierce rivalry that would develop between France and England in the New World, a rivalry that would play a significant role in shaping the future of the continent. Samuel Champlain played a pivotal role in reviving the French fur trade in North America during the early 1600s. As beaver populations on the Atlantic coast dwindled due to overhunting and increased competition with English traders, the profitability of fur trading began to decline significantly. Champlain, a French merchant with experience in the fur trade, recognized the need to explore new territories where beaver populations were still abundant. In 1607, Champlain presented his plan to the French king, proposing to establish a permanent settlement at the end of the St. Lawrence River, deep in the interior of North America. His strategy was twofold. Firstly, to tap into new, untapped beaver populations away from the overexploited coastal areas, and secondly, to create a stronghold that would preempt English traders from accessing these rich fur resources. With the king's approval, Champlain sailed to the New World and, in 1608, founded the city of Quebec. This settlement, unlike the contemporaneously established Jamestown by the English, was primarily focused on the fur trade. Quebec became a crucial trading post where Champlain and his men would receive shipments of goods from France, such as hatchets, knives, pots, and firearms, and then trade these goods with the local indigenous peoples for beaver pelts. Champlain's strategy proved to be highly successful. By moving the center of fur trading inland and establishing Quebec, the French were able to secure a steady and profitable supply of beaver fur, which continued to be in high demand in Europe. Champlain's efforts not only revitalized the fur trade but also laid the groundwork for France's long-term presence and influence in North America. The success of Quebec demonstrated the effectiveness of establishing permanent settlements to control and sustain the fur trade, ensuring that France could continue to profit from this lucrative enterprise while keeping English competitors at bay. As the French fur trade expanded westward, Samuel Champlain and other French traders faced challenges similar to those on the Atlantic coast, such as the overhunting of beavers, leading to their local extinction. Champlain's response to the decline in beaver populations around Quebec was to push further into the interior of North America, establishing new outposts along major waterways to access untapped regions rich in fur-bearing animals. One of the first major expansions was the establishment of Montreal, which served as a critical trading hub after Quebec. Like Quebec, Montreal functioned as a center where French traders would exchange European goods, hatchets, pots, firearms, with local indigenous peoples for beaver pelts. Initially, this trade was highly profitable, but over time, the beaver populations around Montreal also began to dwindle due to overhunting, leading to a need for further expansion. This westward movement continued, with the French setting up small outposts along the Great Lakes and other major rivers. These outposts, often manned by just a few traders, would become the focal points for fur trading in the surrounding regions. The traders would establish relationships with local indigenous groups who would bring furs to these posts in exchange for European goods. As the French moved further west, they encountered new indigenous groups and ecosystems which they would exploit for the fur trade. The environmental impact of this trade was significant. As beavers were driven to extinction in various regions, the landscape changed dramatically. Beavers are natural dam builders, creating ponds and wetlands that support diverse ecosystems. When beavers were removed, these areas often turned into swamps or experienced altered water levels, which had cascading effects on the local environment. An interesting side note is the classification of beavers as fish by the Catholic Church, a move that allowed French fur traders and settlers to consume beaver meat during Lent. This classification was a pragmatic decision to support the fur trade, as it allowed traders to sustain themselves while observing religious practices. As French traders moved deeper into the interior, some chose to integrate into indigenous communities. These coureurs des bois, runners of the woods, would often marry into indigenous families, learn the languages, and adopt local customs. This integration helped them secure exclusive trading partnerships and navigate the complex social dynamics of the indigenous groups they traded with. For some, this life offered an escape from the rigid structures of European society, including the strictures of Catholicism. This westward push, driven by the need to continually find new beaver populations, laid the groundwork for the expansion of French influence across North America. The small outposts that began as trading forts eventually grew into major cities like Montreal and Detroit, with the fur trade serving as the backbone of French colonial expansion. The French fur trade not only reshaped the economy of the region, but also had lasting cultural and environmental impacts. The French fur trade in North America, while more cooperative and less land-intensive compared to the English colonization efforts, still had significant negative impacts on indigenous communities. Unlike the English, who densely populated and cultivated large swaths of land, often leading to violent conflicts with indigenous groups over territory, the French primarily focused on establishing small trading outposts. These outposts were scattered across vast regions, with relatively few French settlers involved. The French relied heavily on indigenous peoples to do the actual trapping and transport of furs, creating a more symbiotic relationship than the English. This dynamic led to what could be seen as a win-win situation at first. Indigenous groups, especially those in hunter-gatherer societies in the interior, gained access to European goods like metal, tools, firearms, and clothing, which significantly improved their quality of life. The beaver, which had been of limited use to these groups before, became a valuable trade commodity, allowing them to acquire items that were previously unavailable. However, this relationship wasn't without its downsides. One of the most devastating impacts of European contact, even in the more cooperative French model, was the introduction of diseases like smallpox. As French fur traders pushed into the interior of the continent, they unknowingly brought with them diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity. These diseases spread rapidly, causing massive depopulation and social disruption among tribes that had previously been untouched by earlier waves of European-born illnesses. In addition to disease, the French also introduced alcohol to indigenous communities, which proved to be another devastating influence. Unlike the Spanish, who imposed restrictions on what could be traded with indigenous peoples, specifically avoiding the sale of firearms and alcohol, the French had fewer qualms about such trade. Alcohol, in particular, had a profound and destructive impact on many indigenous groups. These communities, some of which had never engaged in agriculture and thus had no prior experience with alcohol, were suddenly exposed to spirits without any societal norms or biological tolerance for it. This led to widespread alcoholism, social breakdown, and other forms of devastation within these communities. Recognizing the harm caused by alcohol, the French authorities eventually attempted to regulate its trade, making it illegal to sell alcohol to indigenous peoples. However, enforcement was difficult, especially in remote areas where fur traders operated far from any oversight. The introduction of alcohol remained a significant and lasting negative consequence of the French fur trade. Overall, while the French approach to colonization in North America involved less direct conflict over land and a more cooperative relationship with indigenous peoples, it still resulted in substantial negative impacts, particularly through the spread of disease and the introduction of alcohol. These effects, combined with the overhunting of beavers and the environmental changes that followed, highlight the complex and often harmful legacy of the fur trade in North America. The French fur trade, while primarily economic, also had significant cultural and social impacts on both the indigenous populations and the French themselves. One of the most profound effects of the fur trade was the introduction of firearms to indigenous groups. The French, unlike the Spanish, who avoided trading weapons with indigenous peoples, freely exchanged firearms for beaver pelts. This trade fundamentally altered the power dynamics among indigenous groups. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy, one of the first groups to engage in the fur trade with the French, gained access to firearms and other European goods earlier than many of their neighbors. This technological advantage allowed the Iroquois to expand their territory aggressively. As they exhausted the beaver populations in their own lands, they used their superior weaponry to conquer neighboring tribes, seizing their beaver-rich territories to continue trading with the French. This led to an arms race among indigenous groups, as those without firearms were at a severe disadvantage, leading to increased violence and territorial conflicts. While the fur trade fueled French expansion, it did not lead to large-scale French settlement in North America. Unlike the English colonies, which were densely populated and focused on agriculture, the French presence was characterized by small outposts and trading forts scattered across a vast territory. These outposts required only a few French settlers, relying heavily on indigenous peoples to supply the furs. Consequently, French colonial expansion was less about land acquisition and more about controlling strategic points along trade routes. In addition to fur traders, French missionaries also ventured into North America, aiming to spread Catholicism among indigenous populations. However, their efforts were met with limited success. Unlike Spanish missionaries, who sometimes succeeded by offering goods and protection in exchange for conversion, French missionaries faced significant resistance. Indigenous groups often saw little incentive to adopt Christianity or settle in French missions when they could obtain European goods through the fur trade without abandoning their traditional ways of life. Furthermore, the phenomenon of fur traders going native complicated missionary efforts. Many French traders adopted indigenous customs, married indigenous women, Robert La Salle's expedition down the Mississippi River had a profound impact on the expansion of French territories in North America. La Salle, although not the best leader, was a skilled explorer who played a crucial role in mapping and expanding the French fur trading network. His journey in 1680 to 1682 to explore the Mississippi River and find its endpoint was significant for several reasons. When La Salle and his small expedition reached the mouth of the Mississippi, they became some of the first Europeans to encounter the remnants of the Mississippian culture. Despite the population being greatly reduced by disease, La Salle was impressed by the large cities and the organized agricultural societies he found along the river. These encounters led him to believe that these indigenous groups could be valuable allies and trading partners for the French. The French saw the potential for expanding their influence and control over a vast territory by claiming the Mississippi River and its surrounding areas. La Salle recognized that controlling the Mississippi River would allow France to dominate the interior of North America, linking their Canadian territories in the north with potential new colonies in the south. This strategic control would also give the French a significant advantage over the English and Spanish, who were also vying for dominance in the New World. La Salle's exploration ultimately led to the French claim over the entire Mississippi River basin, which they named Louisiana, in honor of King Louis XIV. This claim extended French influence from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, establishing a vast territory that would later play a critical role in the history of the United States. In modern terms, La Salle's expedition laid the groundwork for French settlement and influence in what would become the central United States, particularly in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. The French presence in these areas would persist until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when the United States acquired the territory from France, dramatically expanding its own borders and setting the stage for further westward expansion. Robert La Salle's expedition down the Mississippi River had a profound impact on the expansion of French territories in North America. La Salle, although not the best leader, was a skilled explorer who played a crucial role in mapping and expanding the French fur trading network. His journey in 1680 to 1682 to explore the Mississippi River and find its endpoint was significant for several reasons. When La Salle and his small expedition reached the mouth of the Mississippi, they became some of the first Europeans to encounter the remnants of the Mississippian culture. Despite the population being greatly reduced by disease, La Salle was impressed by the large cities and the organized agricultural societies he found along the river. These encounters led him to believe that these indigenous groups could be valuable allies and trading partners for the French. The French saw the potential for expanding their influence and control over a vast territory by claiming the Mississippi River and its surrounding areas. La Salle recognized that controlling the Mississippi River would allow France to dominate the interior of North America, linking their Canadian territories in the north with potential new colonies in the south. This strategic control would also give the French a significant advantage over the English and Spanish, who were also vying for dominance in the New World. La Salle's exploration ultimately led to the French claim over the entire Mississippi River basin, which they named Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. This claim extended French influence from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, establishing a vast territory that would later play a critical role in the history of the United States. In modern terms, La Salle's expedition laid the groundwork for French settlement and influence in what would become the central United States, particularly in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. The French presence in these areas would persist until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when the United States acquired the territory from France, dramatically expanding its own borders and setting the stage for further westward expansion. After Robert La Salle's successful journey down the Mississippi River, the French began to solidify their claim over the vast territory that the river encompassed. La Salle formally claimed the entire Mississippi River basin for France in 1682, naming the region Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. This claim was not just a symbolic gesture, it was a strategic move to establish French control over a critical part of North America, effectively linking French Canada with the Gulf of Mexico. La Salle's exploration opened the door for further French expeditions and settlements along the Mississippi River. The French began to establish a series of forts and trading posts throughout the region. These outposts served multiple purposes. They were centers for the fur trade, military installations to protect French interests, and bases for further exploration and conversion efforts by French missionaries. One of the key settlements that emerged from this French expansion was New Orleans, founded in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville. Located near the mouth of the Mississippi River, New Orleans quickly became a vital hub for trade and a strategic military point for the French. The city's location allowed France to control access to the Mississippi River, which was the main artery for transportation and communication throughout the vast Louisiana territory. However, despite the French claims and efforts to control the region, the vastness of Louisiana posed significant challenges. The French population in North America was much smaller than the English colonies to the east, and as a result, French influence in the Mississippi River basin was often limited to a few scattered outposts and alliances with Native American tribes. The French strategy of establishing alliances with Native American tribes was a continuation of their approach in Canada. Unlike the English, who were primarily interested in establishing large agricultural colonies, the French were more focused on trade, particularly the fur trade. This difference in priorities meant that the French were generally more interested in maintaining good relations with Native American groups who were essential partners in the fur trade. However, the French expansion into the Mississippi River Basin was not without conflict. The presence of French soldiers and settlers in the region inevitably led to tensions with both Native American tribes and other European powers, particularly the English and the Spanish. These tensions would eventually culminate in a series of conflicts, including the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, which was part of the larger 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War was a turning point in the struggle for control of North America. The war pitted the French and their Native American allies against the British and their own Native American allies. Despite early successes, the French were ultimately defeated, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the end of French colonial ambitions in North America. Under the terms of the treaty, France ceded control of Canada and all its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, while Spain gained control of the territory west of the Mississippi, including New Orleans. The loss of Louisiana and Canada effectively ended France's role as a major colonial power in North America. However, the legacy of French exploration and settlement in the Mississippi River Basin would endure, particularly in the cultural and linguistic influence that persists in regions like Louisiana to this day. In conclusion, Robert La Salle's exploration of the Mississippi River was a pivotal moment in the history of North America. It led to the establishment of a vast French territory that played a critical role in the colonial power dynamics of the continent. While the French ultimately lost control of their North American empire, their exploration and settlement efforts left a lasting impact on the region, shaping the cultural and historical landscape of the United States. Robert La Salle's exploration of the Mississippi River in the late 1600s was a pivotal moment in French colonial expansion in North America. During this period, the French were steadily pushing into the interior of the continent, driven by the lucrative fur trade. Alongside the fur traders, other groups such as soldiers and missionaries also played key roles in establishing and maintaining French presence in these vast territories. As the French expanded deeper into the interior, they recognized the need to protect their fur trading posts from potential threats, including dissatisfied local Native American tribes who might take issue with trade practices or prices. To ensure the safety of these trading posts, the French crown began to send soldiers to fortify their positions. These soldiers were tasked with defending the fur traders and maintaining French control over these distant lands, especially as English settlers began encroaching on areas claimed by France. By the 1680s, French settlements in North America included key locations such as Quebec and Montreal, along with agricultural communities in regions like Nova Scotia. These settlements were not just isolated trading posts, they were part of a broader French strategy to create a sustainable colonial economy. The agricultural output from these areas, particularly surplus grain, was crucial in supporting both the local population and the far-flung trading posts scattered throughout the interior. Around this time, a major shift in French exploration occurred, largely driven by the ambitions of Robert La Salle. La Salle, though known for his vanity and less than stellar leadership qualities, was nonetheless an effective explorer. His role was crucial for the fur trading companies, as he was responsible for scouting new areas where fur-bearing animals were abundant and establishing connections with friendly Native American tribes. La Salle's explorations in the 1670s led him to realize that many of the rivers he had been navigating funneled into a single, powerful river, the Mississippi. This discovery piqued his interest, and by 1680 he resolved to follow the Mississippi River to its end, to see where it led and what opportunities it might offer for French expansion. In 1680, La Salle organized a small expedition and began his journey down the Mississippi River. When he and his followers reached the river's end, they became some of the first Europeans to witness the remnants of the once flourishing Mississippian culture. This culture, which had built impressive mound cities, had been significantly impacted by diseases brought by earlier European explorers, drastically reducing the population. Despite this decline, La Salle encountered large Native American communities that still existed in the region. La Salle was impressed by these communities, noting their agricultural practices and the potential they offered as allies and trading partners for the French. Even though the Mississippian culture was not as powerful as it had been during the time of Hernando de Soto's earlier explorations, the remnants of this civilization represented a significant opportunity for the French to expand their influence in the region. Recognizing the strategic importance of the Mississippi River and the potential for establishing strong alliances with local tribes, La Salle returned to the French authorities with news of his discoveries. His exploration would eventually lead to the formal claim of the Mississippi River Basin for France and the establishment of Louisiana as a French territory. La Salle's expedition was a key moment in the history of French colonization in North America. It demonstrated the French ability to navigate and explore the continent's vast interior, laying the groundwork for future settlements and fortifications that would stretch from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. While the French presence in North America would face significant challenges in the coming years, La Salle's work was instrumental in shaping the French colonial empire and its legacy in the United States. Robert La Salle's grand vision for the French colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River was driven by both practical trade considerations and ambitious military strategies. While he acknowledged that the fur quality in the warmer southern regions of Louisiana was not as high as in Canada, he saw potential in the area's resources. The animals in Louisiana had thinner fur due to the warm climate, but La Salle still identified opportunities to trade local goods, such as deer and buffalo pelts, albeit not as valuable as the fur from the colder northern regions. More importantly, La Salle realized that the Mississippi River could serve as a crucial trade route. Shipping fur from the interior to Quebec had become increasingly difficult due to the challenging upriver journey. La Salle's insight was that by using the Mississippi River, fur traders could easily transport their goods downstream to the Gulf of Mexico, dramatically reducing the time and effort needed to get the furs to Europe. The strategic location of the river's mouth, near present-day New Orleans, struck La Salle as an ideal spot not just for a trading post, but for an entire colony. La Salle envisioned New Orleans as a central hub for trade, where furs from the interior could be loaded onto ships and sent directly to Europe, bypassing the arduous route back through Quebec. The speed and efficiency of this southern route promised to enhance French trade significantly. But La Salle's ambitions didn't stop at trade. He also saw the strategic military potential of a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi. He noted the proximity of Spanish silver mines in northern Mexico and imagined that a strong French presence in Louisiana could eventually challenge Spanish control of these valuable resources. Even if outright conquest wasn't immediately feasible, La Salle believed that the French could use the Mississippi River as a base for pirating Spanish ships, launching raids, and then retreating to the safety of a well-defended colony. La Salle's grand vision culminated in his claim of all lands connected to the Mississippi River and its tributaries in the name of France. Following the custom of the time, he claimed the entire river system and all lands touching it for King Louis XIV, naming the vast territory Louisiana in his honor. To solidify this claim, La Salle erected a post marking the territory as French and then returned to France to present his plans to the king. Enthused by La Salle's vision, King Louis XIV provided him with 3 ships and 300 settlers, including women and children, to establish a permanent colony at the mouth of the Mississippi. In late 1684, La Salle set sail with his colonists, aiming to reach the mouth of the Mississippi and establish what would become New Orleans. However, the journey would not go as planned. The Mississippi River's delta was complex and difficult to navigate, unlike other rivers that typically widen into easily identifiable bays. Instead, the Mississippi dispersed into a labyrinth of channels and marshes, making it difficult to pinpoint the exact location where the river met the Gulf of Mexico. This navigational challenge proved to be a critical obstacle for La Salle and his expedition. Despite his best efforts, La Salle would struggle to find the exact spot to establish his colony, leading to a series of misadventures that ultimately doomed the mission. Robert La Salle's journey to establish a French colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River took a disastrous turn when he missed his intended destination and ended up on the Gulf Coast of Texas. In 1685, La Salle mistakenly believed he had reached the mouth of the Mississippi, when in fact he was hundreds of miles west. He and his settlers offloaded their ships and began constructing a fort, which they named Fort St. Louis, in what they believed to be the ideal location for their new colony. However, the reality of their situation soon became clear. The landscape around them was vastly different from what they had encountered on previous expeditions along the Mississippi. Instead of the swampy terrain they expected, they found themselves in vast plains with no sign of the river they sought. The local Native American tribes were not the densely populated, sedentary societies they had hoped to trade with, but instead were small, mobile, hunter-gatherer groups who were often hostile towards the intruders. As time passed, it became evident that they were not near the Mississippi at all, and no fur-trading boats were coming to resupply them. Their situation grew dire as their supplies dwindled and they failed to grow crops in the unfamiliar environment. By 1687, less than 100 of the original settlers remained at Fort St. Louis, and it was clear that they were in the wrong place with no hope of outside help. In a desperate attempt to survive, La Salle and his men decided to try to walk back to Canada, leaving behind the women and children in the fort. However, their journey would not end well. Somewhere in what is now East Texas, La Salle's men, frustrated and angry over the failed expedition and La Salle's leadership, mutinied and murdered him. Despite La Salle's death, some of his men managed to survive and eventually made it back to Canada, where they recounted the story of the doomed expedition. The settlers left behind at Fort St. Louis fared no better. The local Native American tribes eventually attacked the fort, killing most of the remaining settlers. A few were captured and assimilated into the tribes, but the settlement was effectively wiped out. Despite the failure of La Salle's expedition, his idea of establishing a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi did not die with him. The French government recognized the strategic value of the location that La Salle had identified. In the years following his death, the French launched other expeditions to populate the lower Mississippi Valley, ultimately leading to the establishment of New Orleans and other settlements that would become crucial to French colonial ambitions in North America. La Salle's tragic end did not diminish the significance of his vision, which would shape the future of French America. As La Salle's ill-fated expedition continued to unravel, it inadvertently sparked a chain of events that shaped the future of the region. Local Native American tribes, curious about the unfamiliar French settlers, reported their presence to the Spanish. Alarmed by the possibility of French encroachment, The Spanish launched a series of expeditions to locate La Salle's colony and realized they needed to establish a stronger presence in the area to prevent further French expansion. This led to the Spanish settlement of Texas, a significant development in the region's history. Meanwhile, the French began to refocus their efforts on Louisiana, settling at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Initially, there was talk of using this region as a base for piracy, targeting Spanish ships and controlling the Gulf of Mexico. However, the evolving political landscape in Europe, particularly the closer ties between the French and Spanish crowns in the early 1700s, rendered this idea obsolete. Instead, the French turned their attention to other opportunities the region offered. One of the primary draws for the French in Louisiana was trade. The Mississippi River became a vital artery for transporting furs from Canada to New Orleans, where they were then shipped to France. This trade route was crucial for the French economy and helped solidify their presence in the region. Additionally, the fertile land in Louisiana proved ideal for growing crops like tobacco and rice, similar to what the British were cultivating in their southern colonies. Recognizing the agricultural potential of the region, the French began importing African slaves to work the land, mirroring the practices of the British colonies. This marked the beginning of a significant shift in the French approach to colonization in North America. Unlike the small fur trading outposts in Canada, Louisiana developed into an agricultural hub with a growing population of enslaved Africans. A depiction of early New Orleans, around 1718 to 1720, provides a glimpse into how French Louisiana functioned. The cleared forests and small boats arriving from the north with fur to be loaded onto larger ships for transport to France highlight the region's economic activities. The presence of African slaves cutting down trees and contributing to the colony's development underscores the labor-intensive nature of the agricultural economy that was taking shape. In summary, while La Salle's expedition ended in tragedy, it set off a chain of events that led to the French and Spanish solidifying their claims in the Gulf Coast region. French Louisiana, initially envisioned as a potential pirate haven, evolved into a thriving agricultural and trade center driven by the labor of African slaves and the strategic location at the mouth of the Mississippi River. He's got it on a leash, whatever it is, and it's pretty because if you look at Louisiana today, the influence of these early interactions is still evident. When the French were mapping out the area, they'd mark where each local group lived. The second largest city in Louisiana today is Baton Rouge, which in French means Red Stick, named after the Red Stick Creeks. You can see that connection in this image. So the French started settling in Louisiana. They're making good money, especially from the fur trade coming down from Canada, and from agriculture. Tobacco and rice were in high demand back in Europe. But French Louisiana didn't grow quickly. Settlement began around 1699 or 1700, but population growth was slow. One major reason was the region's rampant diseases. The stagnant water was a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and many of the French settlers, particularly those from colder climates, had never been exposed to malaria and lacked immunity. Many died in large numbers. Recognizing the importance of Louisiana, the French realized they needed to keep it going. To boost the population, they started shipping convicts over. The French conducted a census, and if I recall correctly, around 1720, they sent 2,000 convicts to Louisiana. Essentially, instead of serving jail time, they became colonists in Louisiana. However, when they did another census 10 years later, only 60 of those men were still alive. Many had died from disease, illustrating just how harsh the conditions were. The French settlement in Louisiana had some similarities to English settlements on the Atlantic coast, but it didn't grow as quickly. The English dealt with disease as well, but not to the extent faced by the French in Louisiana. Another reason for the slow growth of Louisiana was the French shift in focus. They acquired some Caribbean islands from Spain, including Haiti, and a few sugar-producing islands. As Spain declined, losing wars to England and France, the French gained these territories. Once they did, they shifted their attention to sugar production in the Caribbean, which was incredibly profitable. So while they still valued Louisiana and its tobacco and rice, the sugar plantations in the Caribbean became their priority. Now, with the French firmly established in Louisiana, it sent shockwaves to the Spanish. Until this point, they had largely ignored Texas, where hunter-gatherer tribes had made expansion challenging. Since 1607, the Spanish hadn't made significant progress eastward, primarily because they didn't need to. They were focused on their silver mines further south. But the French presence made the Spanish nervous. Suddenly, they felt the need to create a buffer zone between themselves and these new French settlers. So after learning about La Salle's explorations, the Spanish began establishing missions among some of the smaller Native American groups in Texas. Initially, they tried setting up in East Texas among some of the Mississippi culture tribes, but these tribes didn't want any part of what the Spanish were offering. They were doing just fine on their own. As a result, the Spanish ended up establishing missions elsewhere. Among the hunter-gatherer tribes in San Antonio and a few along the Gulf of Mexico coast, the Spanish began establishing missions. Some of these poorer tribes accepted life within these missions. The Spanish sent soldiers to Texas, but they didn't focus much on the region. For the Spanish, Texas didn't hold much appeal. There were no significant mineral resources. They only populated the area to prevent the French from encroaching too close to their valuable silver mines. So, by the late 1600s, around the time the French were settling in Louisiana, the Spanish started settling in Texas. But it was more of an afterthought. In Texas, there were only a few thousand people. Some mission Indians, missionaries, a handful of soldiers, and a few civilians who realized that cattle thrived on the plains. These civilians began raising cattle and shipping them down to market and to the silver mines as a way to make money. The settlement of Texas by the Spanish was a direct response to the French settling in Louisiana. But the effects of the French presence in Louisiana didn't stop there. The English, up until that point, hadn't settled in Georgia. But now, seeing the French in Louisiana and noticing that the Spanish were also paying more attention to the western part of Florida, the English decided that Georgia might be strategically important. So, in 1732, they established a military colony in Georgia, sending a governor there with the mission to prevent the French from threatening the other English colonies and to keep the Spanish at bay. The French settling in lower Louisiana brought regions into play that hadn't been considered before, and it also affected the local Native American groups. As we discussed earlier, the Mississippi culture, tribes in this region had already been significantly reduced by disease in multiple waves. Now, at the start of the 1700s, they found themselves surrounded by Europeans. While this might seem like bad news for them, it actually presented an opportunity for these tribes. With the English, Spanish, and French all nearby, these relatively populous Native American groups, tens of thousands at this point, began to use the situation to their advantage. They started playing the European powers off against each other. Suddenly, they had multiple options for trade: the French, the English, and the Spanish. For example, if one group, like the Cherokees or Creeks, felt threatened by English encroachment, they could approach the French and say, "Hey, the English are getting close. If you don't want them near you, give us some weapons to defend ourselves." The French would then supply them with arms. Similarly, if they weren't getting favorable trade deals from the French, they could threaten to trade with the English instead, forcing the French to offer better terms. This strategy allowed these tribes to not only survive, but also to learn how to deal with Europeans more effectively than other Native American groups. Many began learning English, French, or Spanish, and some even married into the families of European traders. As a result, by the early 1700s, these Mississippi culture tribes became more Europeanized. European traders lived among them, and the tribes began adopting European customs. They started wearing European clothing, building houses in European styles, and growing European crops. This close proximity and constant interaction with the French, English, and Spanish allowed them to adapt and thrive in ways that other Native American groups did not. Unlike groups like the Powhatans, who didn't have the advantage of playing European powers against each other, these tribes were in a unique position. The presence of the French, English, and Spanish allowed them to exploit the rivalries between these powers, fundamentally changing their societies. For instance, the Cherokees recognized that one key advantage the Europeans had was their ability to write. In response, a Cherokee man would go on to develop a writing system for the Cherokee language, enabling better communication among the Cherokee people and giving them a new tool to negotiate with European powers. The arrival of the French in Louisiana reshaped the landscape of North America. Previously, European powers had been more separated, but now they were in close proximity. This change set the stage for what was to come: a major conflict in the mid-1700s that would determine the future of North America, and that's what we'll